Hi, I'm Commander Natalie Brennan. Last Tuesday, my brother, Lieutenant Jake Brennan, stood in his dress blues at the Northpoint Naval Base Officers Club, surrounded by his academy buddies, pointing directly at me and saying, "That's my sister, the one who couldn't even make it through community college. She works at some little nonprofit downtown, basically does nothing with her life." What he didn't know was that Admiral Patricia Westfield was standing 3 feet behind him, holding a classified folder with my name on it. And what none of them knew was that I'd been running covert naval intelligence operations in the South Pacific for the past 6 years, while they thought I was just Nat, the charity worker. By the end of that evening, Jake would be standing at attention in front of his commanding officer, learning exactly who gives the orders around here. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, growing up in Millbrook, Oregon, Jake and I were inseparable. He was 18 months older, and from the time we could walk, we were building forts, playing war games, and dreaming about serving our country. Our dad, Chief Petty Officer Robert Brennan, had served 3 tours before settling down to raise us, and military service wasn't just encouraged in our house, it was expected. Jake took the traditional route. Naval Academy at Annapolis, graduated summa cum laude, perfect officer track record, everything by the book. Everyone in our small town watched him march across that graduation stage and knew he was destined for greatness. I took a different path. After high school, I enrolled at Pacific Northwest Community College for 2 semesters, struggled with the rigid structure, and eventually dropped out. Jake was already a year into the academy when I made that decision, and I'll never forget the phone call home. "Dad, Nat quit school again," I heard him telling our father from the hallway. "I don't know what's wrong with her. She just doesn't have what it takes for anything serious." What Jake didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that 3 days after I officially withdrew from community college, I was sitting in a nondescript government building in Portland, signing papers that would change my life forever. A Navy recruiter had approached me not about traditional service, but about something called the Civilian Intelligence Integration Program. It was so classified that my own father, with his decades of naval experience, had never heard of it. The program was designed to place operatives in civilian roles while they conducted intelligence work that required complete anonymity. No uniforms, no visible rank, no official acknowledgement. We were ghosts in plain sight, and our cover stories had to be bulletproof because our lives depended on them. My cover? A quiet nonprofit worker at the Millbrook Community Outreach Center, helping veterans with housing assistance and job placement. It was perfect. Nobody pays attention to social workers, and it gave me legitimate reasons to interact with military personnel and their families. For 6 years, while Jake climbed the traditional ladder from ensign to lieutenant, I was Lieutenant Commander Natalie Brennan, running intelligence operations across 14 countries. I'd been deployed to situations in the Philippines, South Korea, and 3 classified locations I still can't name. I spoke fluent Mandarin and Korean, had advanced certifications in cybersecurity and international law, and had personally debriefed assets who provided intelligence that prevented 2 potential terrorist attacks on American soil. But to my family, I was just Nat who couldn't hack college, who lived in the same small apartment she'd had since she was 19, who drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic and shopped at thrift stores. Jake would come home on leave and pat my head like it was still his little sister who needed protecting from the world. He'd slip me a $100 bill for groceries and tell his academy friends that he was supporting his struggling sister out of the goodness of his heart. The irony was crushing sometimes. My security clearance was 3 levels higher than his. My last performance review had been signed by people whose names Jake had only seen in Navy Primes articles. I had been personally commended by the Secretary of the Navy for work Jake would never be cleared to even know about. But I smiled and played my part because that's what the mission required. The breaking point came at the Northpoint Naval Base annual officers' reception. Jake had been stationed there for 8 months, and he'd finally convinced me to attend as his guest. "Come on, Nat," he'd said during his last visit home. "I want you to see what real naval officers look like. Maybe it'll inspire you to do something more with your life." I should have said no. I should have made up an excuse about work, which wouldn't have been entirely false since I was actually in the middle of coordinating intelligence handoffs with assets in 3 different time zones. But something inside me was tired of being treated like the family disappointment, and I wanted to see Jake in his element. I wanted to remember why I'd looked up to him so much when we were kids. I had no idea that Admiral Westfield would be there. I had no idea that she'd been looking for me for 3 weeks, trying to coordinate through back channels because my next assignment was so sensitive it required direct briefing from Pacific Fleet Command. And I certainly had no idea that my own brother was about to publicly humiliate me in front of the woman who'd been reading my classified files and calling me one of our most valuable assets in meetings I'd never know about. But that's exactly what happened. And what came next changed everything between Jake and me forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Northpoint Naval Base Officers Club had been decorated for the occasion with maritime flags and gleaming brass fixtures that caught the evening light, streaming through tall windows overlooking Cascade Bay. The sound of dress shoes on polished hardwood mixed with the gentle clink of champagne glasses and the low murmur of conversations about deployments, promotions, and the eternal military topics of duty stations and chain of command. I stood near the entrance in my simple black dress, nothing fancy, just something I'd found at a consignment shop in downtown Millbrook that looked appropriate enough for a military function. My hair was pulled back in a neat bun, minimal jewelry, comfortable flats that wouldn't make noise on the hardwood floors. I looked exactly like what everyone expected. Jake's civilian sister who worked at a nonprofit and was probably a little overwhelmed by being surrounded by so many important military personnel. Jake appeared at my elbow almost immediately, resplendent in his dress blue uniform with the gold stripes that marked his rank as lieutenant. His chest displayed ribbons I recognized: the National Defense Edison Medal, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, a few others that mark standard deployments and good conduct. Respectable by any measure for someone 5 years into his career. "Nat, you look great," he said, and I could hear the slight condescension in his voice that had become so familiar over the years. "Come on, let me introduce you to some people. But remember, these are serious naval officers, so maybe just listen more than you talk, okay?" I smiled and nodded, slipping easily into the role I'd perfected over 6 years of deep cover operations. "Of course, Jake. I'm just happy to be here and see where you work." He guided me through the room, his hand proprietarily on my elbow, introducing me to various officers and their spouses. "This is my sister Natalie," he'd say with a warm smile that somehow managed to sound apologetic. "She works with veterans back home in Millbrook, helps them with housing and job placement. Really important work, even if it's not military service." The responses were predictably polite: handshakes, pleasant smiles, questions about my little nonprofit that Jake would often answer for me. She's always been the caring one in the family, not cut out for military life, but she found her own way to serve. The words stung because they contained just enough truth to feel like genuine affection, wrapped around a core of dismissal that made my chest tight. Commander Rebecca Torres, Jake's direct supervisor, was particularly kind. A woman in her early 40s with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake, she asked thoughtful questions about veteran services and seemed genuinely interested in the housing assistance programs. "That's incredibly valuable work, Natalie," she said warmly. "Sometimes the transition to civilian life is the hardest part of military service." I've learned so much from the veterans I work with. Their stories of service and sacrifice, it really puts everything in perspective. Jake beamed at this response. "See, she gets it, even without having served herself. I'm really proud of the work she does, even if it's small-scale stuff." Small scale. I'd prevented 2 terrorist attacks and provided intelligence that had kept 3 naval vessels from walking into ambushes in contested waters, but my work was small-scale stuff. As the evening progressed, I found myself genuinely enjoying some of the conversations.
These were dedicated professionals who'd chosen lives of service, and their passion for their work reminded me why I'd been drawn to my own unconventional path. I spoke with Lieutenant Commander David Chen about veteran mental health resources, exchanged thoughts with Captain Maria Gonzalez about the challenges of military families, and discussed logistical coordination with Commander James Morrison.
What struck me was how naturally these conversations flowed. I found myself understanding references to military operations, supply chain management, and inter-service coordination in ways that Jake attributed to my work with veterans, but that actually came from 6 years of classified briefings and operational planning. When Captain Gonzalez mentioned challenges with intelligence coordination and joint operations, I had to bite my tongue to keep from offering solutions I'd personally implemented in the field. "Your sister really understands military culture," Commander Torres mentioned to Jake during a lull in conversation. "That's unusual for civilians." Jake's chest puffed up with pride. "She's always been a good listener, absorbs things like a sponge. I think working with veterans has taught her a lot about how we think and operate." If only he knew how much I'd actually absorbed, and from what sources. The one moment that nearly broke my cover came when I overheard 2 junior officers discussing a supply chain issue that sounded familiar. Lieutenant Kara Kim was explaining to Ensign Michael Rodriguez about communication delays affecting a humanitarian mission in the Philippines, the same region where I'd coordinated asset extraction just 3 months earlier. "The intelligence coordination has been a nightmare," Lieutenant Kim was saying. "Our contact protocols keep getting updated without explanation, like someone higher up the chain is managing assets we don't even know about." I knew exactly what she was talking about because I'd been the one updating those protocols. My team had been running parallel operations in the same region, and we'd had to adjust communication windows to avoid compromising each other's work. But I couldn't say anything except nod sympathetically and murmur, "That sounds really challenging." As the evening wound down, Jake grew more relaxed and talkative. The champagne had loosened his tongue, and he began regaling a small group with stories about our childhood, painting himself as the responsible older brother who'd always looked out for his dreamy and practical sister. "Nat's always been in her own world," he laughed, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that felt both affectionate and possessive. "Smart enough, but just never had the discipline for anything really demanding. I used to try to get her to consider military service, but honestly, she's probably better off where she is. Not everyone's cut out for the real thing." The real thing. I smiled and let him talk, watching the faces around our little circle as they absorbed this narrative of Jake, the successful naval officer, and his well-meaning but limited sister. I could see the gentle pity in their expressions, the way they look at me like I was a sweet civilian who was doing her best in her own small way. None of them had any idea that in 18 hours, I'd be leading a classified briefing for Pacific Fleet intelligence, or that the real thing Jake was so proud of representing was something I'd been living at the highest levels for years. But the evening was about to turn a turn that would change all of that forever. The story of how I became Lieutenant Commander Natalie Brennan began on a gray Tuesday morning in March, 6 years earlier, when I was sitting in my beat-up Honda Civic in the parking lot of Pacific Northwest Community College, staring at my withdrawal papers and wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I'd been struggling with sophomore year coursework, not because the material was difficult, but because something fundamental felt wrong about the traditional academic path. While my classmates were excited about choosing majors in business administration or communications, I found myself gravitating toward international relations courses, spending hours reading about global conflict zones and intelligence operations that most people my age had never heard of. My professors had noticed. Dr. Raymond Castellanos, who taught modern military history, had pulled me aside after class 3 weeks before I withdrew. "Miss Brennan," he said, adjusting his glasses in that careful way that suggested he was choosing his words deliberately, "have you ever considered that there might be different ways to serve your country beyond the traditional military track your brother is following?" At the time, I'd assumed he was talking about the Peace Corps or maybe the State Department. I'd thanked him politely and forgotten about the conversation until 2 days after I officially withdrew from college, when I received a phone call from someone who identified herself only as Ms. Rodriguez from Federal Career Services. Natalie Brennan. The voice was professional, crisp. Dr. Castellanos provided your contact information. We understand you're interested in international service opportunities that might align with your unique skill set. Would you be available for an interview this Friday in Portland? I should have been suspicious. A normal 20-year-old probably would have hung up or demanded more information. But something about the call felt like destiny, like a door opening to exactly the kind of life I'd been unconsciously preparing for without knowing it existed. The building in Portland was unremarkable, a standard government office complex near the waterfront with multiple agency logos and the kind of generic beige interior that screamed bureaucracy. But the woman who interviewed me, Lieutenant Colonel Patty Stone, was anything but generic. She was sharp-eyed, direct, and asked questions that revealed she'd done extensive research on my background.
Your brother is excelling at the Naval Academy, she noted, consulting a thick file that contained far more information about my family than should have been available to a random federal employee. Your father's service record is exemplary. 3 tours, commendations for leadership under fire, spotless disciplinary record, both men following very traditional paths to military service. She paused, studying me across the metal desk. Your psychological profile suggests you have the same underlying drive to serve, but your approach to problem solving is considerably more unconventional. You think laterally, you notice patterns others miss, and you have a natural ability to blend into civilian environments while maintaining operational awareness. I remember asking her how she could possibly know any of that from a college dropout who'd never taken a psychology assessment. Dr. Castellanos has been identifying candidates for our program for 8 years, she explained. He's former Defense Intelligence Agency, and he has an eye for recognizing people who might excel in work that requires flexibility and how they approach national service. That's when she told me about the Civilian Intelligence Integration Program. The CIIP was established in 2008 as a response to intelligence gaps that traditional military and CIA operations couldn't fill. The program recruited young people with specific psychological profiles, high intelligence, strong moral compass, ability to maintain cover identities for extended periods, and what the military psychologists called adaptive invisibility, the capacity to become whatever the mission required while maintaining their core identity and loyalty. Traditional intelligence officers have limitations. They're trained in specific protocols, they carry diplomatic credentials or military identification that can compromise them in sensitive situations, and they're often too obviously connected to government operations. Our operatives look like civilians because they are civilians. They live civilian lives, work civilian jobs, and conduct intelligence work that nobody, not their families, not their employers, not their neighbors, can ever know about. The training program was 18 months of the most intensive education I'd ever experienced. I was shipped to facilities in Virginia, Colorado, and California, learning everything from advanced linguistics to cybersecurity to psychological profiling. I became fluent in Mandarin and Korean, learned to hack computer systems and identify surveillance, studied international law and financial crimes, and trained in hand-to-hand combat techniques I prayed I'd never need to use. But the hardest part wasn't the technical training. It was learning to live a double life so completely that even I sometimes forgot which version of myself was real. My cover story had to be bulletproof because my life would depend on it. The Millbrook Community Outreach Center wasn't just a fake job. It was a fully operational nonprofit that actually helped veterans, funded through a complex network of grants and donations that traced back to intelligence budgets but looked completely legitimate on paper. I genuinely helped veterans find housing and employment, genuinely cared about their transition challenges, and genuinely built relationships with them that had nothing to do with my intelligence work. The beauty of the cover was that it gave me natural reasons to interact with military personnel and their families. Veterans would mention their sons or daughters still serving, would share stories about friends stationed overseas,
would sometimes let slip information about operations or deployments that seemed innocent in casual conversation, but provided valuable intelligence when aggregated and analyzed. My apartment in Millbrook was deliberately modest, not because I couldn't afford better, but because my neighbors needed to see me as someone who worked at a small nonprofit and drove an old car. My salary from the Community Outreach Center was exactly what someone in that position would make. My real compensation was deposited into accounts I couldn't access until after my service period ended, managed by financial specialists who understood the unique requirements of deep cover operatives. For 6 years, I'd been Lieutenant Commander Natalie Brennan, but only a handful of people in the world knew that designation existed. My commanding officer was Admiral Patricia Westfield, but our communication happened through encrypted channels and coded messages that looked like routine paperwork to anyone who might intercept them. My performance reviews were classified at levels that meant Jake, despite his security clearance as a naval officer, would never be authorized to know they existed. The loneliness was sometimes crushing. I couldn't share my real achievements with my family, couldn't tell them about the operations I'd led or the commendations I'd received. When Jake would slip me money for groceries, I wanted to tell him that my last mission had saved American lives and that the Secretary of the Navy had personally signed my performance evaluation. When my father would worry about my lack of direction, I wanted to explain that I'd found my direction years ago and had been serving our country in ways he'd never imagine.
But the mission always came first, and part of that mission was maintaining the cover so completely that even my own family believed I was exactly what I appeared to be. Jake's underachieving sister, who'd found her small place in the world helping veterans file paperwork. What I never expected was that my two worlds would collide so dramatically, or that the collision would happen in front of the one person who knew exactly who Lieutenant Commander Natalie Brennan really was. The moment that changed everything began with what should have been a routine conversation about dessert. I was standing near the buffet table, carefully selecting a piece of chocolate cake that wouldn't be too messy to eat while maintaining polite conversation, when I noticed Jake gathering a small crowd near the tall windows overlooking the harbor. His voice had taken on that particular tone he used when he was about to tell a story, slightly louder than necessary, with the confident cadence of someone who knew he had an audience's attention. "You know, it's funny how different people can be, even in the same family," he was saying, to a group that included Commander Torres, Lieutenant Kim, and 3 other officers I'd met earlier in the evening. "Take my sister and me, for example." I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my expression pleasantly neutral and continued slowly cutting my cake into manageable pieces. This was Jake in full storytelling mode, and experience had taught me that interrupting would only make whatever was coming worse. Nat's a good person, don't get me wrong. She tries really hard, and she cares about people, but she's just never been able to handle anything too demanding or complex. Lieutenant Kim glanced in my direction with what looked like sympathy. "She seems lovely, Jake, and her work with veterans sounds really meaningful." "Oh, it is," Jake agreed quickly. "I'm not criticizing what she does. It's perfect for her, actually. Simple, straightforward, helping people with basic needs. She's great at that kind of thing. But anything that requires real, I don't know, strategic thinking or handling pressure, not so much." I took a small bite of cake and focused on the taste of chocolate ganache while my brother continued to dissect my supposed limitations for his professional colleagues. He was saying, warming to his theme, like she tried college twice, just couldn't handle the workload or the expectations. And I get it. Not everyone's cut out for academic rigor or military discipline. Some people are better suited for simpler paths. Lieutenant Kim shifted uncomfortably. "Different people have different strengths, Jake. The work she's doing sounds important." "Absolutely," Jake said, his tone suggesting he was being magnanimous. "I'm proud of her for finding her niche. I just think it's interesting how genetics can work out so differently. Our dad always said I got the leadership genes and Nat got the heart." The leadership genes. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, but a crystalline clarity about exactly how my brother saw me and our relationship. To Jake,
I wasn't just the family underachiever, I was proof of his own superiority, evidence that he'd inherited the qualities that mattered, while I'd been left with softer, lesser attributes. He's always looked up to me, he continued, gesturing toward me with his champagne glass in a way that invited the others to look as well. Ever since we were kids, she's needed guidance. Still does, really. I help her out financially when I can, give her advice about life decisions. She calls me whenever she's dealing with anything complicated. That last part was particularly galling because it contained a grain of truth twisted beyond recognition. I did call Jake regularly, not for advice, but because maintaining family relationships was part of my cover. Our conversations were carefully choreographed on my end, designed to reinforce his perception of me as someone who needed his guidance, while gathering intelligence about his assignments and social connections that might prove useful for my actual work. Lieutenant Kim looked genuinely puzzled, but she seemed so engaged and knowledgeable about military culture. When we were talking earlier about veteran services, she understood concepts that most civilians wouldn't even recognize. Jake's laugh was indulgent. That's just because she's around veterans all day at her little nonprofit. She picks up the terminology, like how kids learn to repeat words they hear without really understanding what they mean. I watched Lieutenant Kim's expression shift slightly, and I could tell she was reassessing our earlier conversation. Had my responses really been that superficial? Was I just parroting back phrases I'd learned from the veterans I worked with? Plus, Jake added, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone that somehow managed to carry perfectly to where I was standing. She's always been impressionable, easily influenced. It's actually something I worry about sometimes. She trusts people too easily, doesn't always recognize when someone might be taking advantage of her.
This was a masterful performance, I had to admit. Jake was managing to sound concerned and protective while systematically undermining any credibility I might have built during my conversations with his colleagues. He was reframing my knowledge as mimicry, my thoughtful questions as naivete, and my professional competence as childlike trust. Captain Gonzalez joined the group, catching the tail end of Jake's commentary. "What are we discussing?" "Just family dynamics," Commander Torres said carefully. Jake was telling us about his sister. "Ah, yes, the non-profit worker," Captain Gonzalez nodded. "Seemed very dedicated when we spoke earlier." "She is," Jake agreed. "Dedicated and hardworking. Those are her strengths. She just operates on a different level than those of us who've chosen more demanding careers." Different level. I set down my plate and walked closer to the group. Not to join the conversation, but to refill my water glass at the nearby beverage station. From this position, I could observe their body language more clearly. What struck me was how uncomfortable some of Jake's audience looked. Commander Torres kept glancing at me with an expression that suggested she was trying to reconcile Jake's description with the woman she'd spoken with earlier. Lieutenant Kim looked genuinely troubled, as if she was wondering whether she'd somehow misread our entire conversation about veteran mental health resources. But Jake was oblivious to their discomfort, energized by what he clearly saw as a successful demonstration of his own perceptiveness and leadership. He was the successful naval officer who understood people and situations, generous enough to support his limited sister while being realistic about her capabilities. "The thing is," he was saying, his voice taking on the tone he probably used when counseling junior officers, "you have to meet people where they are. Nat's never going to be the type to handle high-pressure situations or make strategic decisions, but she can follow directions, and she genuinely cares about helping people. That's valuable in its own way." Follow directions, handle simple tasks, care about people in small, manageable ways. This was how my brother saw me, and by extension, how he was encouraging his professional colleagues to see me. What made it particularly painful was that I could see how his narrative made sense to them. They'd met me as Jake's civilian sister, wearing a simple dress and working at a small nonprofit. They had no reason to question his assessment of my capabilities or his role as the accomplished sibling who looked out for his less capable sister. I finished filling my water glass and turned back toward the main room, catching sight of my reflection in the window overlooking the harbor. For just a moment, I saw myself through their eyes.
Jake's sweet, well-meaning sister who tried hard but would never amount to much beyond her small-scale charity work. The performance was so complete, so convincing, that I almost believed it myself. But as I walked away from the group, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. Near the main entrance, a woman in Admiral stripes was speaking quietly with the club's host, scanning the room with the focused attention of someone looking for a specific person. Admiral Patricia Westfield had arrived. Admiral Patricia Westfield moved through the officers' club with the kind of purposeful grace that made conversations pause and postures straighten without her saying a word. She was in her mid-50s, silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, 3 stars gleaming on her shoulder boards, and when she walked into a room, that room reorganized itself around her presence. I recognized her immediately, of course. I'd been briefed by her personally on 4 separate occasions, had received commendations signed in her precise handwriting, and had sat in classified meetings where she'd referred to my work as essential to Pacific Fleet's security interests. But as far as everyone else in the room knew, I was just Jake's nonprofit worker sister who wouldn't recognize a flag officer if she walked right up to me. Jake was still holding court near the windows, completely oblivious to the Admiral's arrival, continuing his detailed analysis of my supposed shortcomings for anyone within earshot. His voice had gotten slightly louder as the evening progressed, his gestures more expansive, his assessment of my limitations more creative. The problem with Nat is that she's never learned to think critically about complex situations. She means well, but she takes everything at face value. No strategic thinking, no ability to see the bigger picture. I positioned myself near the bar where I could observe both Jake's performance and Admiral Westfield's progress through the room. She was moving methodically, greeting various officers with the appropriate level of formality, but her eyes kept scanning the crowd in a way that suggested she was looking for someone specific.
I've tried to help her develop some analytical skills, Jake continued, his tone suggesting great patience and dedication. I send her articles about current events, try to walk her through basic strategic concepts, but it just doesn't stick. She's better off sticking to what she knows, simple human services work. Lieutenant Commander Chen looked genuinely confused. But when we spoke earlier about veteran employment programs, she had some really sophisticated insights about the intersection of military training and civilian skill sets. That kind of analysis requires pretty advanced thinking. Jake waved this off dismissively. She's just repeating things she's heard from the veterans she works with. Trust me, I've known her my whole life. She's not capable of that level of original thinking. This was becoming a pattern I recognized from our family dynamics, but seeing it play out in a professional setting made it more clearly manipulative than I'd previously understood. Jake wasn't just sharing his opinion about my capabilities, he was actively working to undermine any positive impression I might have made, systematically discrediting evidence that contradicted his narrative. She's also incredibly naive about people, he added, his voice taking on a protective big brother tone. She trusts everyone, never questions motives, doesn't recognize when someone might be manipulating her. It's actually dangerous sometimes. Captain Gonzalez had rejoined the group and was listening with an expression of growing discomfort. Jake, she's standing right over there. Don't you think this is a bit... Oh, she can't hear us, Jake said confidently. And besides, she knows I worry about her. I'm always telling her she needs to be more careful, more skeptical. It's just her nature. She sees the best in everyone. Admiral Westfield had finished her initial circulation of the room and was now speaking quietly with the club's event coordinator, who was pointing discreetly in my direction. I felt my pulse quicken, not from nervousness, but from the sudden realization that my two worlds were about to collide in a way I'd never anticipated. Meanwhile, Jake had moved on to what he clearly considered his most damning evidence of my incompetence. The thing that really worries me, he was saying, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper that somehow carried perfectly across the hardwood floors,
is that she's so easily influenced by authority figures. You put her in a room with someone who sounds official, and she'll believe anything they tell her. No critical evaluation, no healthy skepticism. This observation was particularly rich coming from someone who'd spent his entire adult life following orders without question. But I kept my expression neutral and continued sipping my water. Last month, she called me all excited because some federal contractor had offered her a consulting position. Jake continued, making air quotes with obvious disdain. I had to explain to her that it was probably a scam, that legitimate government agencies don't just randomly offer jobs to people with no relevant experience or qualifications. My blood got cold. He was talking about a real conversation we'd had, but he'd completely misunderstood the context. A month ago, I'd been offered a temporary assignment that would have required me to travel to Washington for briefings related to an ongoing operation in Southeast Asia. Following protocol, I'd created a cover story about a consulting opportunity and mentioned it to Jake to explain why I might be traveling more than usual. His response had been exactly what he was describing, patronizing concern that I was being taken advantage of by scammers who were targeting naive civilians. I'd let him talk me out of the opportunity for the sake of maintaining my cover, when in reality, I'd simply accepted a different assignment that didn't require travel. I mean, who's going to offer a consulting contract to someone who couldn't even finish community college? Jake was saying, with a laugh that several of his audience members clearly found uncomfortable. But she was completely convinced it was legitimate. I had to really work to get her to see reason. Lieutenant Kim looked genuinely distressed. Jake, maybe we should change the subject. No, it's important, Jake insisted, his voice taking on the earnest tone he used when he thought he was making a crucial point. People like Nat, good-hearted but limited, they're exactly the kind of targets that scammers and con artists look for. Someone needs to protect them from their own gullibility. Admiral Westfield had finished her initial circulation of the room and was now moving directly to our section of the room. She walked with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where she was going and wasn't in any hurry to get there, but her path was unmistakably aimed at Jake's little gathering. The sad thing is, Jake continued, completely oblivious to the approaching storm, is that she actually thinks she understands complex situations. She'll read an article about international relations or military strategy and thinks she's qualified to have opinions about it. It's almost enduring, really.
Commander Torres caught sight of Admiral Westfield approaching and straightened immediately, her expression shifting to full attention. "Admiral on deck," she said quietly, and the entire group turned and came to attention. Jake spun around, his face immediately shifting from casual storytelling mode to professional military bearing. "Admiral Westfield," he said crisply, coming to attention with the precision drilled into him at Annapolis. "At ease," Admiral Westfield replied, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made the words feel like they had physical weight. Her eyes swept the group, taking in each face with the careful assessment of someone who missed very little. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said pleasantly. "I was just looking for someone, and I believe she might be in this area." Jake's chest puffed up slightly with pride. Clearly, the Admiral was looking for him, probably to discuss his performance or perhaps offer him some kind of opportunity. This was exactly the kind of recognition he'd been working toward his entire career. "Of course, Admiral," he said eagerly. "How can we assist you?" Admiral Westfield's gaze moved past Jake and locked directly onto mine. "I'm looking for Natalie Brennan," she said clearly. "I understand she's here this evening." The silence that followed Admiral Westfield's request lasted exactly 4 seconds, but it felt like watching a slow-motion explosion. I could see the confusion ripple across Jake's face as his brain tried to process why a 3-star admiral would be looking for his nonprofit worker sister at a naval reception. "I'm sorry, Admiral," Jake said carefully, his voice carrying the slightly strained politeness of someone who was certain there'd been a mistake. "Did you say Natalie Brennan? My sister?"
"That's correct, Lieutenant," Admiral Westfield replied, her tone remaining professionally neutral. "Is she here this evening?" Jake's confusion deepened, and I could practically see him trying to calculate what possible reason a flag officer could have for wanting to speak with me. The only logical explanation, from his perspective, was that something had gone wrong. "Yes, ma'am, she's right here," he said, gesturing toward me with the kind of protective urgency that suggested he was already preparing to handle whatever trouble I'd somehow gotten myself into. "Nat, the Admiral wants to speak with you." I stepped forward with the same slightly overwhelmed demeanor I'd maintained all evening, carefully modulating my voice to sound both respectful and slightly nervous. "Yes, Admiral, is everything all right?" Admiral Westfield studied me for a moment, and I caught the faintest flicker of something that might have been amusement in her eyes. "Miss Brennan, I wonder if we might have a brief word in private. There's a matter I'd like to discuss with you." Jake immediately stepped closer, his protective instincts fully activated. "Admiral, if there's some kind of problem, perhaps I could help clarify the situation. Nat doesn't really understand military protocols, and she might not be able to provide whatever information you're looking for." The condescension in his voice was so automatic, so reflexive, that I don't think he even realized how it sounded. He was genuinely trying to help, operating from his fundamental belief that I needed protection from situations beyond my comprehension. Admiral Westfield's expression remained carefully neutral, but I noticed her posture shift slightly. "Lieutenant Brennan, I appreciate your concern for your sister, but I believe she's quite capable of speaking for herself." "Of course, Admiral," Jake said quickly. "I just meant that if there are any complex issues or if she's somehow gotten involved in something she doesn't understand, I might be able to help navigate the situation." Commander Torres looked increasingly uncomfortable, and I could see Lieutenant Kim exchanging worried glances with Lieutenant Commander Chen. Jake's words were technically respectful, but the underlying assumption that I was too incompetent to handle a conversation with a senior officer was becoming impossible to ignore. "Jake," I said softly, playing my role perfectly, "I'm sure I can manage a conversation. The Admiral probably just wants to ask about veteran services or something related to my work." Jake's expression brightened with relief. Of course, that made perfect sense. The Admiral probably heard about some veteran issue and wanted to get information from someone who worked directly with former service members. This was exactly the kind of simple, straightforward interaction that would be appropriate for someone at my level. "That's probably it," he agreed, his voice warming with the confidence that came from having figured out the situation. "Nat works with a lot of veterans, Admiral. She might have useful information about community resources or transition services." Admiral Westfield nodded slowly. "Something like that, yes. Miss Brennan, shall we step onto the terrace? It's a bit quieter out there." As we began to move toward the French doors that led outside, Jake called after us with the kind of cheerful confidence that made my chest tighten. "Admiral, just so you know, Nat's really knowledgeable about basic veteran services, but if you need anything involving policy analysis or strategic planning, I'd be happy to assist. She's great with the human side of things, but the bigger picture stuff isn't really her strength."
I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just condensation anymore. Jake was actively attempting to limit my credibility with my commanding officer. He was so convinced of his own superior capabilities that he was undermining me to a woman who had personally overseen operations that had saved American lives, who had read classified assessments of my work, who knew exactly what I was capable of in ways Jake would never be cleared to understand. Admiral Westfield paused in the doorway and turned back to face Jake. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made even experienced officers stand straighter. "Lieutenant Brennan," she said clearly, "I want to be very clear about something. Your sister is not here in any capacity related to basic veteran services. The matter I need to discuss with her involves strategic intelligence assessment at the highest levels of Pacific Fleet operations." The words hit the group like a physical force. Jake's face went completely blank, as if his brain had simply stopped processing information. Commander Torres's eyes widened, and I could see Lieutenant Kim's mouth actually fall open slightly. Furthermore, Admiral Westfield continued, her tone remaining professionally measured but carrying an unmistakable edge, Miss Brennan's qualifications for this discussion are not subject to your assessment or approval. She is here because I specifically requested her presence, based on her extensive experience with classified operations that you are not cleared to know about. Jake's face had gone from confusion to something approaching panic. Admiral, I think there might be some confusion. Nat works at a small nonprofit. She doesn't have any experience with classified anything. Admiral Westfield's gaze remained fixed on Jake with the kind of steady attention that made junior officers very uncomfortable. Lieutenant, I'm going to give you some advice that will serve you well throughout your naval career. When a flag officer tells you something about operational matters, the appropriate response is not to argue based on your personal assumptions. The rebuke was delivered in such a calm, professional tone that it took a moment for its full impact to register. But when it did, Jake's face flushed red, and I could see him struggling to process the fact that he'd just been corrected by a 3-star admiral for questioning her judgment about my qualifications. Ma'am. Yes, ma'am, he managed, his voice tight with the kind of humiliation that comes from realizing you've made a serious error in front of your peers. Miss Brennan, Admiral Westfield said, turning back to me with a slight smile that held layers of meaning I was certain only I could read. Shall we continue our discussion? As we stepped onto the terrace, I could hear the stunned silence we'd left behind us. Through the glass doors, I could see Jake standing frozen among his colleagues, his face's study in confusion and growing horror as he began to understand that everything he thought he knew about his sister was wrong. Admiral Westfield waited until we were well away from the doors before she spoke again, her voice dropping to the tone she used for classified conversations. Lieutenant Commander, she said quietly, I need to inform you that your cover may be compromised. I felt my training kick in immediately, the same cold clarity that had gotten me through 6 years of high-stakes operations. What's the nature of the compromise, Admiral? 3 days ago, we intercepted communications suggesting that hostile intelligence services have identified members of the CIP program operating in the Pacific Northwest region. Your name wasn't specifically mentioned, but the description of assets matches your operational profile closely enough to be concerning. My mind immediately began running through protocols. A compromised cover meant potential extraction, reassignment, possibly the end of my operational career. It also meant that every relationship I'd built over 6 years, including my family relationships, might need to be severed for security reasons. What's the timeline for assessment? I asked. We need a full operational review within 72 hours. But there's a complication. The review requires your presence at Bangor Naval Base for classified briefings that could last several days. Your cover story won't support that kind of absence without raising questions.
I understood immediately. The Millbrook Community Outreach Center couldn't explain why I would suddenly need to disappear for a week of meetings with naval intelligence. My family couldn't be told the truth about where I was going or why. And after tonight's public interaction with Admiral Westfield, any sudden departure would seem suspicious to exactly the wrong people. Admiral, I said carefully, I believe we may have a more immediate problem than my cover story. Your brother's reaction to this conversation? Yes, ma'am. Jake isn't going to let this go. He's going to ask questions, do research, try to understand what just happened. And he has legitimate security clearances that will give him access to information that could compromise not just my cover, but the entire program. Admiral Westfield was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. Jake's clearance as a naval officer would allow him to access personnel databases, operational schedules, and intelligence briefings that could reveal patterns pointing to the CIIP program's existence. His curiosity about his sister's apparent connection to classified operations could lead him to exactly the kind of investigation that would expose other operatives. What do you recommend, Lieutenant Commander?
This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since I'd accepted this assignment 6 years ago. Every operational decision I'd made, every relationship I'd maintained, every aspect of my cover identity had been building toward the possibility that my two worlds would collide and I'd have to choose between them. I recommend we accelerate my operational status change. Move me to overt intelligence work with appropriate cover for action. Create a narrative that explains tonight's conversation without compromising the covert program and gives me legitimate reasons to be involved in classified activities going forward. That would mean ending your deep cover assignment. Yes, ma'am, but it would also mean that my family relationship with Lieutenant Brennan becomes an asset rather than a liability. Instead of trying to hide my real work from him, we create a story that satisfies his curiosity while keeping him inside our operational security perimeter. Admiral Westfield was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. Jake's clearance as a naval officer would allow him to access personnel databases, operational schedules, and intelligence briefings that could reveal patterns pointing to the CIIP program's existence. His curiosity about his sister's apparent connection to classified operations could lead him to exactly the kind of investigation that would expose other operatives. What do you recommend, Lieutenant Commander? I recommend we accelerate my operational status change, move me to overt intelligence work with appropriate cover for action. Create a narrative that explains tonight's conversation without compromising the covert program and gives me legitimate reasons to be involved in classified activities going forward. That would mean ending your deep cover assignment. Yes, ma'am. But it would also mean that my family relationship with Lieutenant Brennan becomes an asset rather than a liability. Instead of trying to hide my real work from him, we create a story that satisfies his curiosity while keeping him inside our operational security perimeter. Admiral Westfield nodded slowly. You're thinking about bringing him into limited knowledge of your actual role. With appropriate security protocols, yes. Jake's desperate to understand what happened tonight. If we don't give him an explanation he can accept, he's going to create his own, and that's going to be dangerous for everyone. I could see her running through the same calculations I was making. Jake's personality, his need to be the responsible, protective older brother, made him predictable in ways that could be useful. If we gave him a role in protecting my new cover identity, he'd throw himself into that mission with the same dedication he brought to everything else. What kind of cover for action are you proposing? Transition me to overt naval intelligence with a specialty in veteran community liaison. It explains my nonprofit background, gives me legitimate reasons to interact with civilian veteran populations, and provides cover for the travel and meetings my real work requires. Jake gets to feel like he's part of something important by helping maintain my operational security. And if he asks about your previous qualifications for intelligence work, we tell him the truth, that I've been quietly recruited and trained over the past several years based on my community connections and educational background. He knows I studied international relations before dropping out of college. We frame it as the Navy finally recognizing potential they saw early but couldn't act on until now. Admiral Westfield was quiet for several minutes, looking out over the water while she considered the implications. Through the glass doors, I could see Jake still standing with his group of colleagues, but his body language had changed completely. He was no longer the confident storyteller holding court. He looked like someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. There's one more factor we need to consider, Admiral Westfield said finally. Your performance reviews for the past 6 years show that you're one of our most effective operatives. Transitioning you to overt work means losing someone who's exceptionally good at deep cover operations. Yes, ma'am, but it also means gaining someone who can use their established community connections openly, who can operate with full support infrastructure instead of in isolation. And it means we can finally give you the recognition your work has earned.
That thought hit me harder than I expected. For 6 years, I'd served my country at the highest levels while watching my family worry about my lack of direction and achievement. The idea of being able to acknowledge even a fraction of what I'd accomplished, of having Jake see me as someone capable of important work, was more appealing than I wanted to admit.
Admiral, there's something else I need to tell you about tonight's conversation. Go ahead. Jake didn't just question my qualifications to you. He's been systematically undermining my credibility to his colleagues all evening. He's told them I'm naive, easily manipulated, incapable of strategic thinking. If we're going to bring him into limited knowledge of my real work, he needs to understand the consequences of that behavior. Admiral Westfield's expression hardened slightly. Are you saying he's compromised your ability to work effectively with naval personnel who might be relevant to future operations? I'm saying he's created a situation where his colleagues see me as someone who can't be trusted with important information or responsibilities. That could be a problem if my new cover requires me to interact with them professionally. Then we need to address that as part of the transition process. Admiral Westfield pulled a secure phone from her jacket pocket and typed a brief message. I'm initiating the paperwork for your status change effective immediately. Within 48 hours, you'll have new credentials and a cover story that will satisfy your brother's questions while keeping the CIIP program secure. What about the operational review you mentioned? That becomes part of your transition briefing. Instead of compromised cover requiring extraction, we frame it as a promotion opportunity requiring enhanced clearances. I felt something I hadn't experienced in 6 years. The possibility of living without constantly maintaining a false identity. Of being able to acknowledge at least some portion of my real work and accomplishments. Of having conversations with my family that weren't entirely based on deception. Admiral, what do I tell Jake tonight? Tell him that you've been working with veteran community organizations in ways that brought you to the attention of naval intelligence, and that you'll be able to explain more after you complete some additional security clearances. Give him just enough truth to satisfy his immediate curiosity while making it clear that full explanations will have to wait. And if he pushes for more information? Admiral Westfield smiled, and for the first time all evening, it reached her eyes. Lieutenant Commander, I suspect that after tonight's conversation, your brother is going to be much more careful about making assumptions about what you are and aren't capable of understanding. When Admiral Westfield and I returned to the Officers' Club 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had completely changed. Word of our conversation had spread through the room with the efficiency that only military communities can achieve, and I could feel the weight of curious stares as we walked back through the French doors. Jake was exactly where we'd left him, surrounded by the same group of officers, but his posture had shifted from confident storyteller to anxious interrogator. The moment he saw us approaching, he straightened with the kind of desperate hope that suggested he'd spent our entire absence trying to convince himself that there'd been some kind of misunderstanding. "Nat," he called out as soon as we were within earshot, his voice carrying a forced casualness that fooled absolutely no one. "Everything okay? The Admiral didn't keep you too long, I hope." I could see him searching my face for clues, trying to read my expression for signs of whatever crisis he'd certain I somehow created. In his worldview, there was simply no other explanation for why a flag officer would need to speak privately with his underachieving sister. "Everything's fine," I replied, maintaining the same slightly overwhelmed demeanor I'd used all evening. "Just some questions about veteran services coordination." Jake's relief was visible, his shoulders dropping as he seized on this perfectly reasonable explanation. "Of course, I told everyone that's probably what it was about. Nat knows all the local veteran service organizations, Admiral. She's really plugged into that community." Admiral Westfield nodded politely. "Miss Brennan was indeed very helpful," she said, her tone giving nothing away. "We'll be following up on some of the information she provided." This was exactly what Jake needed to hear. His sister had been useful to a senior officer in the simple, straightforward way that matched his understanding of her capabilities.
The crisis he'd imagined was just his overactive protective instincts getting the better of him. "That's fantastic," Jake said, his confidence returning in waves. Nat's always been great at connecting people with resources. It's really her strength, the personal touch, you know? She may not understand the big picture strategic stuff, but she knows how to help individuals. I watched Admiral Westfield's expression remain carefully neutral as Jake continued to explain my limitations to her, apparently having learned nothing from their earlier interaction. Commander Torres was looking increasingly uncomfortable, and I could see Lieutenant Kim closing her eyes briefly as if she was in physical pain. "I'm glad she could be helpful," Admiral Westfield said evenly. "Miss Brennan, I'll be in touch about those follow-up questions we discussed." "Of course, Admiral. I'll make sure to gather any additional information you might need."
Jake beamed with pride. This was his sister at her best. Helpful, deferential, staying in her lane. "That's really reliable that way," he told the Admiral earnestly. "Once you give her clear instructions about what you need, she'll follow through perfectly. She's not much for independent initiative, but she's great at executing simple tasks." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I could see several of the officers exchange glances that ranged from embarrassed to horrified. Lieutenant Commander Chen actually took a step back, as if he was trying to distance himself from Jake's comments. But Jake was oblivious to their reactions, energized by what he saw as a successful demonstration of his protective big brother role. He'd correctly identified what the Admiral needed from his sister, had provided context for her limitations, and had helped facilitate a positive interaction. In his mind, this was leadership in action. "You know what I love about this?" Jake continued, addressing the group with renewed confidence. "This is exactly the kind of thing Nat should be doing, working with real military professionals, providing support in areas where she has actual expertise. It's so much better than some of those scam consulting opportunities she gets fooled by." Admiral Westfield's eyebrows raised slightly. "Scam consulting opportunities?" "Oh, yes," Jake said, launching into the story with the enthusiasm of someone who thought he was sharing a charming anecdote. "Just last month, some supposed federal contractor tried to convince Nat they wanted to hire her for some kind of strategic planning work. Can you believe this? They probably figured she looked like an easy target, someone naive enough to fall for that kind of obvious con." I felt my stomach tighten as Jake continued, completely unaware that he was describing a legitimate offer for classified work to the woman who had probably authorized it. "I had to really work to convince her it wasn't real," Jake said proudly. "She was so excited about it, talking about how they'd seen her unique qualifications and wanted her expertise on complex international situations. I mean, come on, Nat's never even traveled outside Oregon except for family vacations." Lieutenant Kim looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Commander Torres was staring at her drink with intense concentration. Even Captain Gonzalez, who had missed most of the evening's earlier conversations, was clearly uncomfortable with Jake's ongoing commentary. But Jake maintained his professional composure, though I caught the slightest tightening around his eyes. "Lieutenant Brennan, may I ask what authority gave you to make strategic decisions about your sister's career opportunities?" Jake blinked, clearly confused by the question. I was just trying to protect her, Admiral. She doesn't always recognize when people are trying to take advantage of her." "And you felt qualified to assess the legitimacy of federal contracting opportunities?" "Well, I mean, it was obviously fake. No legitimate government agency would—" Jake's voice trailed off as he began to understand that he might be walking into dangerous territory. "Would what, Lieutenant?" Jake's face had gone pale, but he'd committed to his position and couldn't see a way to back down without admitting he'd been completely wrong about something he'd been extremely confident about. "Would offer that kind of high-level work to someone without the appropriate background and qualifications," he finished weakly. Admiral Westfield nodded slowly. "I see. And you determined that your sister lacks the appropriate background and qualifications for federal consulting work based on what assessment?" The trap was perfectly laid, and Jake had walked directly into it. Every word he'd spoken tonight about my limitations, every dismissive comment about my capabilities, every protective intervention in my life, all of it was now being examined by a 3-star admiral who knew exactly what I was qualified for and what opportunities I'd been denied because of his interference.
Admiral, I said quietly, playing my role to perfection. Jake was just trying to look out for me. I know he meant well. But Admiral Westfield's attention remained fixed on Jake. Lieutenant Brennan, I think it would be valuable for you to understand something about making assumptions regarding people's qualifications for classified work. Jake's face had gone from pale to gray. Admiral Westfield reached into her jacket and withdrew a slim leather folder that I recognized immediately as the type used for classified document transfers. The room seemed to contract around us as she opened it with deliberate precision, revealing official Navy letterhead that caught the light from the overhead chandeliers. "Lieutenant Brennan," she said, her voice carrying the kind of formal authority that made conversations stop throughout the officers' club, "I want to read you something from an official Navy document dated 18 months ago." Jake's face had gone beyond pale to an almost grayish white, but he remained at attention, unable to do anything but listen as Admiral Westfield began to read from what was clearly an official performance evaluation. Lieutenant Commander Natalie M. Brennan has demonstrated exceptional capability in strategic intelligence analysis and field operations coordination. Her performance in Operation Pacific Shield resulted in the successful extraction of 3 high-value assets from contested territory, preventing what analysts estimate could have been significant loss of American lives. The words hit the gathered officers like physical blows. I watched Commander Torres's eyes widen, saw Lieutenant Kim's mouth fall open, witnessed Lieutenant Commander Chen take an involuntary step backward. But my focus remained on Jake, whose face was cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and growing horror. Admiral Westfield continued reading. Her linguistic capabilities and cultural intelligence have proven invaluable in establishing operational networks across Southeast Asia. Lieutenant Commander Brennan's ability to maintain extended deep cover assignments while coordinating complex intelligence operations represents the highest standards of naval service. Jake's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Lieutenant Commander?" Recommended for accelerated promotion track and consideration for advanced operational assignments requiring top-secret/sensitive compartmented information clearance levels, Admiral Westfield finished, closing the folder with a crisp snap that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could hear the distant sounds of the kitchen staff cleaning up, the soft jazz still playing through the sound system, the gentle lap of waves against the seawall outside. But in our immediate circle, no one seemed to be breathing. "Admiral," Jake finally managed, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't understand. That can't be. Nat doesn't." "Lieutenant Commander Brennan," Admiral Westfield said, addressing me directly with my actual rank for the first time in public, has been serving in the naval intelligence community for 6 years. Her civilian employment has been a cover assignment maintained for operational security purposes. Jake turned to look at me with an expression I'd never seen before, complete bewilderment mixed with something that might have been betrayal. "Nat, what is she talking about?" I looked at him steadily, letting my carefully maintained mask of civilian confusion drop for the first time all evening. When I spoke, my voice carried the confidence and authority I'd been hiding for years. "I'm talking about the fact that while you've been telling people I couldn't handle anything complex or demanding, I've been running intelligence operations across 3 countries and managing assets whose names you'll never be cleared to know." The transformation in my demeanor was immediate and complete. 6 years of practiced civilian mannerisms fell away, replaced by the bearing of someone who'd been making life-and-death decisions while Jake thought I was filing paperwork for veterans' housing applications. "But you work at the nonprofit. You drive that old Honda. You live in that tiny apartment." Jake's voice was getting higher, more desperate as he tried to reconcile everything he thought he knew about me with what he was hearing. "All part of my cover," I replied calmly.
Deep cover operatives maintain civilian identities that have to be completely convincing, even to family members, especially family members. Commander Torres found her voice first among the gathered officers. Ma'am, when you say deep cover, I mean that for 6 years, Lieutenant Commander Brennan has been living a completely fabricated civilian identity while conducting classified intelligence operations. Her family, her employer, her community, none of them knew her real role or her actual rank. The consulting opportunity, Lieutenant Kim said quietly, the pieces clicking together in her mind. Admiral Westfield nodded grimly, was a legitimate offer for a classified assignment that required Lieutenant Commander Brennan to travel to Washington for strategic briefings, an assignment she was unable to accept because her cover required her to maintain the appearance of someone who wouldn't qualify for such work. Jake looked like he was going to be sick. I cost you a job? A real job?
You cost me an assignment, I corrected. One that would have advanced my operational capabilities and potentially saved lives. Because you were so convinced that I was too naive and unqualified to recognize a legitimate opportunity when I saw one. The full weight of his interference was beginning to settle on Jake's shoulders. Every protective intervention, every time he'd steered me away from opportunities he deemed unrealistic, every conversation where he'd explained my limitations to other people, all of it had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I was capable of. But why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice barely audible. Why didn't you tell any of us? Because the mission required operational security that couldn't be compromised by family relationships, Admiral Westfield answered before I could respond. Lieutenant Commander Brennan's cover had to be convincing enough to fool enemy intelligence services. That meant it had to be convincing enough to fool everyone. Captain Gonzalez, who had been silent throughout most of the evening's revelations, finally spoke up. Admiral, are you saying that Lieutenant Brennan has been undermining his sister's actual military career based on his assumptions about her civilian cover identity? That's exactly what I'm saying, Captain. The implications hit Jake like a series of physical blows. His face went through another cycle of expressions: shock, shame, horror, and finally a kind of desperate understanding as he began to grasp the full scope of what he'd done. Nat, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was helping. I know you did, I replied, and for the first time all evening, my voice carried genuine sadness rather than hidden anger. That's what made it so hard to watch. Every time I'd told someone you weren't qualified for complex work, you were undermining the credibility of a naval intelligence officer. Every time I steered you away from opportunities, you were interfering with classified operations. Jake closed his eyes, and I could see him replaying years of conversations, reconsidering every interaction we'd had through the lens of what he now knew about my real work. The magnitude of his misunderstanding was staggering, but even more devastating was the realization that his protective instincts, the thing he was most proud about himself as a brother, had actually been harmful. Lieutenant Brennan, I want to be clear about something, Admiral Westfield said, her voice carrying a tone that suggested this was an official statement rather than casual conversation. Your sister's service record is exemplary. Her contributions to national security have been significant and measurable. She has earned the respect and commendation of senior leadership across multiple commands. She paused, letting those words settle before continuing. The assumptions you have made about her capabilities and the way you have communicated those assumptions to other naval personnel reflect poorly on your judgment and your understanding of operational security. Jake straightened, recognizing the formal nature of the Admiral's words. Yes, ma'am. Going forward, you will refer to your sister by her proper rank when discussing her with other naval personnel. You will not speculate about her qualifications or assignments, and you will remember that there are aspects of naval service that exist beyond your current clearance level and understanding. Understood, Admiral.
Admiral Westfield turned back to me, her expression softening slightly. Lieutenant Commander Brennan, your operational status is being modified effective immediately. You'll receive new orders within 48 hours. I nodded, understanding that my 6 years of deep cover were officially over, replaced by whatever new assignment would emerge from tonight's revelations. Thank you, Admiral. As the group began to disperse, the weight of what had just happened settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Jake remained frozen in place, staring at me as if he was seeing me for the first time in his life. Which, in many ways, he was. The drive back to Millbrook that night was the longest 43 minutes of my life. Jake had insisted on driving me home, his hands gripping the steering wheel with the kind of white-knuckled intensity that suggested he was afraid it might disappear if he loosened his hold on it. For the first 20 minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick with 6 years of misunderstanding and the weight of revelations that had fundamentally altered everything we thought we knew about each other. When Jake finally broke the silence, his voice was rough with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. "How long have you been lying to me?" he asked. I stared out the passenger window at the dark Oregon countryside rolling past us, considering how to answer a question that was both completely fair and utterly impossible to answer simply. "I've never lied to you, Jake. Everything I told you about my work at the Community Outreach Center was true. Everything I told you about helping veterans was real. I just didn't tell you about the other work I was doing at the same time." "The other work, you mean? Running intelligence operations when I thought you were filing paperwork for housing applications?" "Yes." "For 6 years?" "Yes."
Jake pulled over to the side of the highway and put the car in park. In the dim light from the dashboard, I could see that his hands were shaking slightly. When he turned to look at me, his expression was raw with the pain I'd never seen before. "Do you have any idea what this feels like?" he asked. "Finding out that everything I thought I knew about my own sister was wrong? That I've been treating you like a child who needed protection when you outrank me? When you've been doing work that I'll probably never be cleared to even hear about?" The anguish in his voice cut deeper than I'd expected. I'd been so focused on maintaining my cover, so carefully managing the operational requirements of my assignment, that I'd never fully considered what the revelation would cost him emotionally. "Jake, I never wanted—" "You never wanted what?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "You never wanted me to find out? You never wanted me to know that every time I gave you advice about your career, every time I slipped you money because I thought you were struggling, every time I explained to people that you were doing your best but just wasn't cut out for anything demanding, every single time I was humiliating both of us?" I felt something crack inside my chest. The careful emotional distance I'd maintained throughout 6 years of deep cover work suddenly seemed inadequate for handling my brother's pain. "I never wanted you to feel like this," I said quietly. "That I couldn't tell you the truth without compromising operations that were bigger than our family relationship." "Operations that were bigger than our family relationship?" Jake repeated, as if he was testing how the words sounded. "Jesus, Nat, do you hear yourself? You sound like..." "Like what?" "Like a different person, like someone I don't know at all." He wasn't wrong. The woman sitting in his passenger seat, the one who spoke casually about operational security and classified assignments, was someone Jake had never met before tonight. For 6 years, he'd known Natalie the nonprofit worker, Natalie the community college dropout, Natalie who needed his guidance and protection. Lieutenant Commander Natalie Brennan was a complete stranger to him. "I'm the same person I've always been," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't entirely true. 6 years of living a double life had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. "No, you're not," Jake said with devastating clarity. "The person I thought was my sister couldn't handle college coursework. The person sitting next to me has been managing international intelligence operations. Those aren't the same person, Nat. They can't be." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of that realization settling between us. Finally, Jake started the car again and pulled back onto the highway. But his posture had changed. He was no longer driving his little sister home. He was transporting a superior officer whose real identity he was still struggling to process. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. "Anything." "That night last month, when I called you about the consulting opportunity,
when I convinced you it was a scam. Did you know it was real? I closed my eyes, remembering that conversation. Jake had been so concerned, so earnest in his desire to protect me from what he was certain was fraud. I'd played my part perfectly, letting him talk me out of an assignment I'd actually wanted to accept. Yes, I knew it was real. And you let me convince me not to take it? My cover required me to be someone who would listen to your advice about career decisions, someone who might not recognize legitimate opportunities without your guidance. Jake's laugh was bitter and broken. So you sacrificed a real assignment to maintain the fiction that I was the smart, successful sibling who knew better than you did? The mission required operational security that— Stop, Jake said sharply. Just stop with the operational security justifications. I need you to answer me as my sister, not as Lieutenant Commander Brennan. Did you let me torpedo your career because you thought it was more important to protect my feelings than to do your job? The question hung in the air between us, demanding the kind of honesty that 6 years of cover work had trained me to avoid. But Jake deserved better than operational justifications. He deserved the truth, even if it was complicated and painful. Yes, I admitted. I chose to protect your feelings over accepting that assignment, and I've done it more than once. How many times? Jake, how many times, Nat? How many opportunities have you passed up because you didn't want me to feel stupid for not knowing who you really were?
I thought about the promotions I declined because they would have required me to travel too much to maintain my cover. The advanced training opportunities I'd turned down because they would have made my absences from Millbrook too difficult to explain. The commendations I'd received that I couldn't share with anyone who mattered to me. I don't know exactly. Several. Jake pulled into my apartment complex and parked in front of my building, but he didn't turn off the engine. In the fluorescent glow of the parking lot lights, I could see him struggling with emotions he didn't have names for. I need you to understand something, he said finally. For 6 years, I thought I was the successful one. I thought I was the brother who'd made something of himself while you were struggling to find your way. I was proud of my service record, proud of my achievements, proud of the fact that I was taking care of my family. He turned to look at me directly, and I could see tears in his eyes. Do you know what it feels like to discover that while you were being proud of yourself for achieving the rank of lieutenant, your little sister was already a lieutenant commander running operations you'll never be cleared to know about? That while you were patting yourself on the back for being the responsible sibling, she was making decisions that probably saved American lives? Jake, I need you to let me finish, he said finally, because I need to say this out loud, and I need you to hear it. I have been wrong about everything. About you, about myself, about our family dynamics. I have spent 6 years treating you like you were less capable, less intelligent, less accomplished than me, and you let me do it because your job required you to maintain a cover that made me feel superior. The words were coming faster now, as if he was afraid he'd lose his nerve if he didn't get them all out at once. I knew I fared with your real career because I thought I knew better than you did about what you were capable of. I undermined your credibility to other naval officers because I thought I was protecting you from being taken advantage of. I have been, for 6 years, the exact kind of arrogant, condescending officer that I always said I'd never become. He stopped talking and sat back in his seat, emotionally exhausted from the confession. And the worst part, he added quietly, is that you've been so good at your cover that even now, even knowing the truth, part of me still wants to give you advice about how to handle the situation. Because 6 years of thinking I was the one who understood how the world worked doesn't just disappear in one evening. I reached over and put my hand on his arm. Jake, you were trying to take care of me. You were being a good brother. No, he said firmly. I was being a good brother to someone who didn't exist. I was protecting and advising a fictional character while completely failing to see or support the real person sitting right next to me. He turned off the engine and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts sorrow and determination. I don't know how to fix this, Nat.
I don't know how to be your brother when I don't even know who you really are." 2 weeks later, I stood in Admiral Westfield's office at Bangor Naval Base, wearing my dress blue uniform for the first time in 6 years. The insignia felt strange on my shoulders. Not heavy exactly, but present in a way that my civilian clothes had never been. Lieutenant Commander stripes that I'd earned through classified operations were finally visible to the world, and the adjustment was more disorienting than I had expected. "Your new assignment briefing," Admiral Westfield said, sliding a folder across her desk. "Naval Intelligence Pacific Region, Community Liaison Operations. You'll be working with civilian veteran organizations to identify potential security concerns and intelligence opportunities within veteran communities across the Pacific Northwest." I opened the folder and scanned the first page. It was perfect. A cover that legitimized all my previous nonprofit work, while giving me operational authority I'd never had as a deep cover operative. I'd be able to use my real expertise openly, coordinate with other intelligence professionals without pretense, and finally receive recognition for the work I'd been doing in the shadows. "This also comes with a promotion," Admiral Westfield added. "Effective immediately, you're being advanced to full commander. Congratulations." Commander. The rank I'd been working toward for years, finally acknowledged and official. I should have felt triumph, satisfaction, the culmination of a career path that had required more sacrifice than most people could imagine. I felt a complex mixture of relief and loss that I couldn't quite untangle. "Thank you, Admiral. I'm honored."
Commander Brennan, I want you to know that your service during these past 6 years has been exceptional. The CIIP program is being restructured based partly on lessons learned from your assignment, and your insights will be valuable in training future operatives. She paused, studying my expression with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades reading people in high-stress situations. "I also want you to know that the decision to transition you to overt status wasn't made lightly. Your effectiveness as a deep cover operative was extraordinary, but sometimes the mission evolves, and the best way to serve is to adapt with it." "I understand, Admiral." "Do you? Because I need to know that you're committed to this new role, not mourning the loss of your old one." The question caught me off guard with its directness. Admiral Westfield had always been perceptive, but this felt like she was reading thoughts I hadn't fully articulated to myself. "Admiral, may I speak freely?" "Always. For 6 years, I've been 2 different people. Natalie, the nonprofit worker, was someone I created and maintained for operational purposes. But she was also simpler. Her problems were manageable. Her relationships were straightforward. Her life had boundaries that made sense. Commander Brennan gets to be successful and recognized, but she also has to deal with the complexity of relationships with people who knew Natalie." Admiral Westfield nodded. "You're talking about your family." "Among others, but yes, primarily my family." "How are things with your brother?" I thought about the conversation Jake and I had shared 3 days earlier in my apartment, the first real conversation we'd had since the night of the officer's reception. He'd sat on my couch, looking like he was visiting a stranger, struggling to reconcile 6 years of one relationship with the reality of a completely different one. "It's complicated," I said finally. "Jake wants to support me and be proud of my achievements, but he's also dealing with the fact that his entire understanding of our family dynamic was wrong. And I'm trying to figure out how to be his sister without being the person he thought was his sister. That sounds exhausting." "It is, for both of us." Admiral Westfield was quiet for a moment, and I could see her weighing her words carefully. "Commander, I've seen a lot of good people struggle with the transition from covert to overt operations. The psychological adjustment is significant, and the relationship challenges are often the hardest part. Have you considered that this might be an opportunity rather than just a problem?" "What do you mean?" "You spent 6 years being someone smaller than you actually are. Someone less capable, less accomplished, less important than the truth. That kind of diminishment, even when it's voluntary and mission-critical, takes a toll. Now you get to be yourself fully for the first time in years.
That's not just professionally liberating, it's personally liberating. She was right, though I hadn't thought about it in quite those terms. For 6 years, I'd been carefully managing every interaction, every response, every demonstration of capability to maintain a fiction that required me to be less than I was. The relief of dropping that pretense was profound, even when it came with complications. As for your family, Admiral Westfield continued, they're going to have to learn who you really are. That's their work to do, not yours. Your job is to be authentically yourself and let them catch up. Later that afternoon, I drove to the Millbrook Community Outreach Center for what would be my last day as a volunteer coordinator and my first day as a naval intelligence liaison. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was returning to the same building, working with many of the same people, but in a completely different capacity. Sarah Martinez, the center's director, greeted me at the front door with a smile that was equal parts welcoming and bewildered. "Commander Brennan," she said, testing out my real title with careful pronunciation. "I have to admit, this is going to take some getting used to." "For all of us," I agreed. Sarah had been briefed on my new role, that I would continue working with the center, but now as an official Navy liaison, focused on veteran community security issues. She didn't know about my previous 6 years of classified work, and she didn't need to. As far as she knew, I'd been recruited by naval intelligence based on my demonstrated effectiveness in civilian veteran services. "I have to ask," Sarah said, as we walked toward what had been my cramped volunteer office and was now being converted into a proper liaison workspace, "did you always know this was where you wanted your career to go? You seemed so content with the community work." "I was content with the community work," I said honestly, "but I also always knew I wanted to serve in ways that might require more formal authority." It wasn't a lie exactly, more like a careful selection of truths that honored both my cover story and my real experience without compromising either.
My first official meeting was with Robert Chen, a Marine veteran who'd been coming to the center for housing assistance. He was one of several veterans I'd identified during my volunteer work as having skills and background that might make him valuable for certain types of intelligence work. The kind of assessment I'd been making informally for years, but could now act on officially. "So you're Navy now?" Robert asked, settling into the chair across from my desk with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been coming to see me for months. "I always was Navy," I said. "I just wasn't able to wear the uniform before." Robert studied my face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read people in dangerous situations. I always wondered about you. You asked better questions than most civilian coordinators, understood things about military culture that usually take people years to pick up. What gave me away?" "Nothing specific, just a feeling that you knew more than you were letting on. Made me trust you more, actually. Figured if you were keeping secrets, you probably had good reasons." This was exactly the kind of response I'd hoped for from the veteran community. Many of them had served in roles that required operational security, and they understood better than most civilians that there were legitimate reasons for not sharing everything about your background and capabilities. "Robert, I want to talk to you about some opportunities that might be opening up. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would interfere with your civilian life, but ways to use your skills and experience that might be valuable to the community." "What kind of opportunities?" "The kind that require security clearances and come with good benefits." Robert's smile was knowing. "The kind you couldn't have offered me 2 weeks ago when you were just a volunteer coordinator." "Exactly." That evening, I met Jake for dinner at a small restaurant in downtown Millbrook. It was our first public appearance together since the night at the Officers Club, and I could see him struggling with how to introduce me to the waitress, how to talk about my work, how to navigate the simple social interactions that had become complicated by the truth. "How was your first day as an official naval officer?" he asked after we'd ordered. "Strange," I admitted. "Good, but strange. Like putting on clothes that fit properly for the first time in years." "And the people you worked with before, how are they handling the transition?" "Better than I expected.
Most of them seem relieved to have an explanation for things that never quite made sense about me. Yes, that's formal. Jake nodded, but I could see him working through something in his mind. Nat, Commander, I don't know what to call you anymore. Nat is fine. You're my brother, not my subordinate. But that's just it, Jake said. I am your subordinate. You outrank me. If we're both in uniform, you could give me orders that I'd have to follow. Jake, that's not how family works. But it's how the Navy works, and we're both Navy. I realized he was grappling with something I hadn't fully considered, the institutional implications of our new dynamic. In our family, Jake had always been the senior sibling, the one with more experience and authority. But in our professional lives, those roles were now reversed in ways that neither of us had experience navigating. We'll figure it out, all of it. The family stuff, the Navy stuff, the complicated parts where they overlap. But Jake, I need you to know something. What? I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you. Your service record is exemplary. Your leadership abilities are genuine, and your dedication to taking care of people matters. None of that changes because I turned out to be different than you thought. Jake's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. I'm proud of you too, he said quietly. I just wish I'd known who I was being proud of. 6 months after that night at the Officers Club, I received an invitation that brought everything full circle. The annual Pacific Fleet Intelligence Conference was being held at the Northpoint Naval Base, and as the newly appointed Director of Community Intelligence Operations, I'd been asked to deliver the keynote address on civilian-military intelligence integration. Standing at the podium in the same ballroom where Jake had once dismissed me as incapable of complex thinking, I looked at an audience of naval intelligence professionals, many of whom I'd worked with during my years of deep cover operations. The irony was profound, but more than that, it felt like a completion of something that had been broken for too long. Good morning, I began, my voice carrying easily to the back of the room. I want to start by talking about the most dangerous assumption in intelligence work, the belief that we know who has valuable information and who doesn't. In the third row, I spotted Jake sitting with a group of officers from his current assignment at Naval Base Kitsap. 6 months ago, he would have been in this audience hearing about his sister's supposed limitations. Today, he was here to support a presentation about methodologies I'd developed during operations he'd never be cleared to hear about in detail. For 6 years, I operated as a deep cover intelligence officer while maintaining a civilian identity that was specifically designed to appear unremarkable. During that time, I encountered hundreds of people, family members, colleagues, community leaders, who made assumptions about my capabilities based on surface-level observations. Those assumptions weren't malicious or unusual. They were human nature. I clicked to my first slide, which showed a simple organizational chart of the Community Outreach Center. But here's what I learned. The same factors that made my cover convincing, my apparent ordinariness, my focus on simple tasks, my deferential manner with authority figures, those same factors exist in real people throughout our communities, people whose potential we might be overlooking because they don't fit our expectations of what valuable intelligence assets look like. Commander Torres, now stationed at Pearl Harbor, nodded from the front row. She'd become one of my strongest advocates for the Community Intelligence Program, partly because she'd witnessed firsthand how wrong initial assessments could be. During my civilian assignment, I identified 17 individuals who possessed skills, knowledge, or access that proved valuable to ongoing operations. None of them looked like traditional intelligence assets. They were veterans struggling with housing issues, community volunteers organizing food drives, small business owners trying to navigate federal contracts. But they had languages, cultural knowledge, technical skills, or social connections that our traditional recruitment methods would never have discovered. I clicked to the next slide, showing a map of the Pacific Northwest with dozens of small dots representing successful intelligence partnerships developed through community engagement. The lesson isn't just about recruitment methodology. It's about recognizing that valuable capabilities often exist in places and people we don't expect. The veteran who seems to be struggling with basic life skills might also be someone who spent 3 tours in Afghanistan and speaks fluent Pashto. The community college dropout might have taught herself cybersecurity techniques that surpass what some of our certified analysts can do. Lieutenant Kim, who'd been promoted to lieutenant commander and was now running her own intelligence team, raised her hand. Commander, how do you balance operational security with this kind of broad community engagement? Excellent question. The key is understanding that community intelligence isn't about bringing civilian volunteers into classified operations. It's about recognizing that the boundary between civilian and military communities is more porous than we sometimes acknowledge, and that our most effective intelligence often comes from understanding those connections rather than compartmentalizing them. I paused, thinking about how to frame the next part of my message, the personal lesson that had emerged from my own experience. There's another aspect to this that goes beyond operational methodology. For 6 years, I lived as someone smaller than I actually was. I accepted limitations that weren't real, deferred to people who didn't actually know more than I did, and allowed my capabilities to be defined by other people's comfort levels rather than my actual performance. The room was completely quiet now, and I could see people leaning forward slightly, recognizing that this was moving beyond standard operational briefing into something more personal. That experience taught me that we don't just underestimate potential assets in our communities, we sometimes underestimate ourselves. We accept narratives about our limitations that may have been accurate once, but aren't accurate anymore. We defer to authority that may not actually be better informed than we are. We allow other people's assumptions about our capabilities to become our own assumptions. I clicked to a slide that showed before and after photos of the Community Outreach Center, the cramped volunteer office I'd worked in, and the professional liaison workspace it had become. The most valuable intelligence asset in any operation is accurate information, but that includes accurate information about ourselves, our real capabilities, our actual knowledge, our genuine potential. When we operate from false assumptions about what we can and can't do, we compromise the mission just as surely as if we'd used bad intelligence about enemy positions. After the presentation, during the reception that followed, Jake approached me near the same bar where I'd stood 6 months earlier. Pretending to be overwhelmed by military culture, I actually understood better than most of the people in the room. "That was incredible, Nat," he said, and I could hear genuine pride in his voice. Not the condescending pride he'd once felt for my small achievements, but real respect for significant professional accomplishment. "Thank you. It felt good to be able to talk openly about work I've been doing for years. Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think I've learned anything from all this? About assumptions, I mean. About not underestimating people?" I studied his face, seeing someone who spent 6 months genuinely grappling with the implications of how wrong he'd been about someone he thought he knew completely. "What do you think?"
Jake smiled ruefully. "I think I'm still learning. Last week, one of my junior officers came to me with an idea for improving our inventory management system. My first instinct was to explain why it wouldn't work, because she's only been in the Navy for 2 years. Then I remembered that 2 years in the Navy was more experience than I thought you had when you were already running international operations. And I listened to her idea instead of dismissing it. Turns out she has a degree in logistics management and experience with supply chain optimization from her civilian career. Her proposal could save us about 40 hours a week of administrative work. That's exactly the point. Experience and capability don't always look the way we expect them to. I'm trying to remember that. With my sailors, with my colleagues, with... He paused, smiling. With my sister, who apparently knows how to do things I can't even pronounce. Later that evening, I sat in my apartment, the same modest one-bedroom I'd lived in throughout my deep cover assignment,
but which now felt like a choice rather than a requirement, writing in the journal I'd kept throughout my intelligence career. For 6 years, those entries had been careful, coded, designed to look like personal reflections rather than operational notes. Tonight, for the first time, I could write freely about both my professional and personal life. What I've learned, I wrote, is that the most dangerous limitation isn't the one imposed by circumstances or authority or even enemies. It's the limitation we accept about ourselves because it's easier than challenging other people's assumptions or defending our actual capabilities. I set down my pen and looked out the window at the lights of Millbrook, thinking about all the people in this small community who had skills, knowledge, and potential that exceeded what anyone expected from them. Veterans who spoke languages the State Department needed. Small business owners who understood international markets better than some trade officials. Community volunteers who could organize logistics operations that would impress military planners. The real intelligence victory, I continued writing, isn't just identifying valuable assets in unexpected places. It's creating environments where people feel safe revealing their actual capabilities instead of hiding them to avoid disappointment or exploitation. My phone buzzed with a text message from Admiral Westfield. "Outstanding presentation today, Commander. The Secretary of the Navy has asked for a briefing on your community intelligence methodology. Congratulations on work that's changing how we think about national security." I smiled, thinking about how different this felt from the commendations I'd received during my deep cover years, recognition I couldn't share with anyone who mattered to me. This achievement belonged to Commander Natalie Brennan, and I could celebrate it openly with my family, my colleagues, and my community. But the real victory wasn't professional recognition. It was the knowledge that I'd spent 6 years learning one of the most valuable lessons in intelligence work. Never underestimate anyone, including yourself. Have you ever stayed quiet just long enough to let someone reveal who they really think you are, only to discover that their assumptions were completely wrong? Have you ever found yourself living smaller than your actual capabilities because it was easier than challenging other people's expectations? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single response, and honestly, some of your stories about hidden talents, unexpected expertise, and moments when you finally showed people what you were really capable of have been the highlight of building this community. Because here's what I know for sure. Every single person watching this has capabilities that someone in their life has underestimated. Every one of you has knowledge, skills, or potential that doesn't match how you've been categorized by others. The question isn't whether you have more to offer than people realize. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.